afternoon session, and we're going to proceed with our keynote speech for today. And the keynote will be delivered by Professor Bill Kirby of Harvard University. He's the Chang Professor of Chinese Studies and the Spangler Family Professor of Business Administration. And he's also a Harvard University Distinguished Service Professor. And he has a wide range also of professional experience. He served as the Dean of Harvard College for quite a while, and his scholarship covers many different fields. Yeah? So he started as a historian of Sino-German relations, Germany and Republic in China. And he also is a great authority in other facets of Chinese history and world history, and also in corporate history and different aspects of the corporate world. He also has written quite some influential studies on the history and the current status and the future of education. And in this context, I should mention his most recent book, Empires of Ideas, Creating the Modern University from Germany to America to China, which is published by Harvard University Press in 2022. And originally, Bill wanted to be in Göttingen and present this book over here. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to come, but we're very glad to see you here online. It's great to see you. And he's also not going to talk about his book right now, but in the face of the crisis, the Ukrainian crisis, he will deliver a talk which is called China and the World in the New Era, Reflections After February 24th, 2022. So Bill, welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dominic. I'm really delighted to be part of this conference, and I only wish that I could join you all in Göttingen. I want to thank Dominic and his colleagues for all of the work that's gone into this fascinating several days, and the invitation to look at China in global perspective. I will do exactly what Dominic just said I would do in the first part of my talk, but I won't miss the opportunity to introduce you all to this new book. As well, which relates to the changing world of China's place in a changing world. But let me start, and I'm going to start by sharing my screen with you all, and by playing some slides here. Andreas, can we see those okay?
Very well.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay. Well, February 24th, 2022. You know, there are dates in history that remain in our collective memories. In Chinese history and in modern Chinese history, May 4th, 1919, or June 4th, 1989. These have become symbols of hope mixed with frustration. And in world history, dates can sometimes track the beginnings and ends of epochs. Another date, June 28th, 1914, the date of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. This is one such date, a date that would be followed very quickly by Germany's famous blank check to do Austria whatever it wished to do with Serbia. Let us hope that February 24th may not turn out to be a date of such commensurate importance as June 28th and its aftermath. But we must ask the question, would the Russian invasion of Ukraine have happened on February 24th without another blank check, that given by President Putin, by President Xi, 20 days earlier with their joint statement of common interests and their friendship without limits, as they put it, in this so-called new era? You know, blank checks turn out to be very expensive to cash. Just ask Erich Ludendorff, whose memoirs recall his view about Austria in 1915. He, quote, could not understand why so strong and vital a body as Germany should ally itself with a corpse. And yet Germany was allied to a corpse, to a declining empire unable to hold on to its periphery. And China, if not formally allied today, and if not associated simply with a corpse, it has in its Russian partner another empire, an ancient empire on life support, struggling to hold on to its extremities. And China today, like Germany then, is a rising power with a rapidly increasing industrial and technological potential, and with some frustration with the existing global order. So for a conference dealing with China in a changing world order, this is a moment of some consequence. For this new Russian-Chinese quasi-alliance goes against many of the strongest traditions and principles of modern China's foreign relations. And I think Professor Fan Xin has just shown us the value of sometimes looking to a particularly Chinese historical perspective. The Qing state, at the height of its power, was able to deal independently on a bilateral basis with all of the neighboring states, kingdoms, and tribes on its borders or beyond its borders. Unlike the emerging great powers of Europe, Qing China had no natural allies and no permanent enemies, but a complex of mutually separable relations. That freedom of maneuver, as we know, would be severely restricted in the 19th century, in the era of imperialism, as the Qing was forced to deal with the powers, the Western powers and then Japan, as a group. But this also led Chinese statecraft to steadily try to regain its freedom of maneuver by dealing, whenever it could, with foreign powers individually, or as Liu Hongzhang put it, to neutralize one poison with another. Under the nationalists in the 1920s and 1930s, a foreign policy that was based on independent bilateral initiatives was a key factor in revising the so-called unequal treaties and restoring Chinese sovereignty at home. China's freedom of maneuver would be severely restricted in, Republican China, no less than Imperial China, had no automatic allies. Even when its strategic situation vis-a-vis Japan grew rather desperate after 1931, China pursued a multiplicity of independent cooperative relations, including notably with Germany, but also with the USSR, the United States, and the United Kingdom. And it wasn't until the outbreak of full-scale war in 1937 that China sought a military alliance with any nation willing to fight Japan. China, in other words, had no experience as an ally in the modern military diplomatic sense of the word until December of 1941. And the next 20 years of alliance, first with the United States and then with the Soviet Union, these are exceptions to the rule of the history of Chinese diplomacy. Neither alliance was perfectly successful. The Sino-American alliance was somewhat of a shotgun marriage, born of sudden necessity to deal with a common enemy. And it succeeded at its core task, defeating Japan. And it saved or helped to save China as an independent state. When that task was accomplished, however, the fissures in US-China relations appeared very quickly indeed. The Sino-Soviet alliance worked massively in favor of the security and nation-building priorities of the new People's Republic, whose leader, after all, had been studying Stalin for years and sided with him in what became a global Cold War. And it left industrial monuments and architectural high points, but it could not withstand a 30-year alliance that lasted less than 10 in reality. It could not withstand Mao Zedong's personal pretensions to the leadership of the communist world and as the successor to Stalin. So why now return to this alliance if that is indeed what we are witnessing? Surely this is not an economic alliance of significance, which it actually was for China in the 1950s. Chinese trade with Russia since 2001 has gone up, of course, as global trade and China's international trade has gone up, but it is a small, tiny percentage of that between China and the United States. The same could be said of Europe. Compared with the 1950s, the tables are a bit turned because China is now the big brother and Russia is the supplicant. But this alliance without limits appears to be rooted, above all, in the mutual revisionism of Presidents Xi and Putin to restore a world in which a proudly communist China stood arm in arm with the Soviet Union, a country whose demise both of them somehow still mourn. Why is this from the Chinese perspective? Well, it's useful to remember that the Chinese Communist Party was founded by the Soviet Union, or at least with the strong assistance mobilized by the Communist International that reported to Moscow. And we have this very simple and unarguable fact. 没有苏联就没有中国共产党，没有苏联就没有中华人民共和国。This does not mean that the Soviet Union brought the Chinese Communist Party to power, but the Soviet Union is an indispensable founder or father of that party and an ally in its rise to power. And the Chinese Communist Party today has an indelible Soviet DNA in its political system. We can see this in terms of those who brought, this is the Comintern agent Borodin, who served both the nationalists and the communists in their period of the United Front. President Xi has frequently and publicly lamented the fall of the Soviet Union, even in overseeing the production, I gather, of a recent film of the history of the Soviet Union, shown to party cells across the country, the history of a great Soviet Union, of a great Stalin, and indeed of a tragic demise of the Soviet Union. And he's publicly lamented that the Soviet Union fell because they were not man enough to preserve it. He may not realize, however, that no country did more to destroy communism as an international movement than did China, and twice. First with Mao Zedong's very nasty and public break with Moscow in 1960, then again in 1989, when the events at Tiananmen Square would be watched with revulsion on television screens all across Europe, including in every country in Eastern Europe. And in places like East Germany, would delegitimize the use of force to put down demonstrators. Erich Honecker, some of you may recall, wanted to use what he called the Chinese solution, but nobody in the East German leadership would go with him. And so Honecker went to Chile instead. The Chinese solution to public demonstrations was employed only in Romania. And I think you all know the results there. So why again today, friendship without limits? Perhaps the only logical answer is that this is not simply or primarily Chinese foreign policy or the foreign policy interests of China as a nation state or as a country, but Chinese Communist Party foreign policy. And it may, in the short run, be a domestically useful policy for the Chinese Communist Party, though it hardly seems well suited for China's national interests, at least as perceived from the outside, as a rising global power. The Chinese Communist Party may rule China, but its interests and that of the nation, as we know, are not perfectly coterminous. That is why hundreds of Tsinghua University graduates signed a public petition calling Putin a warmonger. And public opinion, to the degree that we can measure it, is not apparently enthusiastic about this war. The majority of people on China's best course of action say, and this would be a great idea, that China could negotiate an end to the conflict. Interestingly, about the same percentage would like to sell weapons to Russia as would like to sell weapons to Ukraine, in any event. Meanwhile, as we know, the international response to China's invasion of a sovereign state with internationally recognized borders, recognized also by China that recently celebrated 30 years of diplomatic relations with Ukraine. This must serve as a cautionary tale for this new Sino-Russian entente. And each day the war continues, the more united the so-called democratic world appears to be. And the world may be perhaps dangerously coalescing into blocs of power, not just unlike not just like that of the Cold War, but perhaps reminiscent of Europe on the eve of the First World War. In any event, China may have to recalculate and plan for a more united international response to any future Chinese action, for example, regarding Taiwan. Interestingly, for their part, it does appear that Chinese companies, Chinese businesses, are adhering strongly to global sanctions for fear in part of secondary sanctions. And so we may say that while a blank check was surely given, there seems to be a credit limit as China scrambles to preserve other national interests. Perhaps we are in but the first early days of this next new era, if that is in fact what it is. 3 months after June 28th, 1914, a world war had broken out, and count ourselves lucky that it had not yet. Like early 20th century Germany, China shows a combination of great talent, great ambition, and in its leadership, political insecurity. But unlike Germany, and here we have Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg, unlike Germany in 1914, it has not taken a leap into the dark of great power warfare. Rather, China's return to great power status after the disaster of the Maoist years has been predicated not on war, but on peace. And the period between 1979 and today is the longest period in East Asia of peace since the Opium War. That peace is the absolute prerequisite for China's prosperity. This is perhaps not the best slide to show China's prosperity, but certainly shows an exuberance, and perhaps nobody did more to bring about prosperity across China's borders than this gentleman, more than most government ministers, although he's not an unprosperous man himself. This era of peace, the more important point, has led to a happier role for China in a shifting global order. China as an economic power, China as an innovator, China as a lead investor in developing countries. And in the topic closest to my heart, which Dominic referenced, China as a leading power in higher education. I've always believed that China's return to a leading role in the world has been because of, not despite, its engagement in global, intellectual, scientific, and economic currents. And I think that no other realm shows this possibility as clearly as the realm of higher education, which is another area of shifting global orders. And let me just give you a little bit of an introduction to this volume, which will be out, not yet, but for sale next week. And it's the story of the modern university as it has arisen from Germany to America to China. And I apologize to Professor Sachsenmeier that it is a story that doesn't really begin in Göttingen, although there is significant mention of Göttingen in the opening chapter. The story of the modern university and of international universities learning one from another begins in Berlin, the modern research university, in 1810 with the founding of the University of Berlin and the founding role attributed to Wilhelm von Humboldt. You know, it's a remarkable thing that sometimes failure in war can lead to investment in other areas, and it was Prussia's extraordinary defeat at the hands of Napoleon that led Frederick William III to say something that very few politicians have ever said. We need to restore with intellectual strength, he said, what we have lost in physical strength. And he tasked Humboldt and others with the establishment of this modern Lehranstalt in the center of Berlin, across from the palace, a place that has set the model for every modern research university the world over, a place dedicated to Lehrfreiheit, to Lernfreiheit, to academic autonomy, to the centrality of the philosophical faculty as the center of the university, and the unity of teaching, of research and learning, research and teaching, that is to say, where faculty have the task for the first time of actually creating knowledge, not simply passing it along. And I think, as you all know, and I don't have time, this is a book that, well, I'll think of getting ahead of myself. This is a book that looks at how German universities became the leaders of the 19th and global standard centers of the 19th century, how the Americans had their innings, as it were, in the 20th century, and looks at the prospect for Chinese leadership in the 21st century. It's also a series of independent case studies. And so Berlin is home to two of these case studies of the University of Berlin and the Freie Universität Berlin, where I actually was a student in the 1970s under what was called a Luftbrückendank stipendium. I won't get into this in great detail at the moment, but I began this project in 2010 when I attended the 200th anniversary of the Humboldt University. And the president and the title of the conference welcome that was being hosted for the 200th anniversary of Humboldt was the modern original and the model for all modern universities. And the president of the Humboldt University welcomed us all in the Senate chamber at the second floor of this wonderful building by telling us, and I quote, "Nobody would take my university as a model for anything today." Now, he is no longer the president of the Humboldt University, but this is an example about how one of the greatest institutions in the world can become not only no longer the greatest university in the world, not even in Germany, indeed, perhaps not even in Berlin. Not everything goes up forever. My own university, Harvard, became a great university. It emulated, of course, British colleges and standards in the 17th and 18th centuries, but it became a modern university only by plagiarizing the norms of the University of Berlin in the second half of the 19th century, as did more forward-looking universities like Johns Hopkins and the University of Chicago, which we also emulated. The University of California at Berkeley, another of my case studies, is an example. It was founded by German-educated scholars from Yale, dedicated to public higher education in the United States. And it is emblematic of both the great rise and strength of public higher education in the United States, and today, the great Achilles heel, in my view, of American higher education, that consistent disinvestment of higher education and in public goods in the United States. 44 out of 50 states in the United States are at this moment disinvesting in public higher education. And as the system, or the great system of the University of California declines, as it surely will, the great private universities of the United States, which compete with Berkeley for faculty and graduate students, will also in turn decline. Another case study is that of Duke University, in which I argue at some length, but not today, is the most rapidly rising research university in the United States and the most self-consciously international with its new extraordinary liberal arts college in Kunshan Duke Dashi. And this brings us to the story of Chinese universities. Chinese universities are rising, as we all know, with extraordinary speed. It is the fastest growing system in quality as well as quantity in the world, outpacing what the Americans had done in the 1950s or the Europeans in size in the 1970s. Here's a map, and it is a system that has been growing not just recently, but for over 100 years, and a system that has been fundamentally based on international norms, architecturally, as well as intellectually. This is the campus, as you can see, of Peking University, really Yanjing Daxue, Yanjing University, and the product of an American architectural firm from New York. This is the great red building from which the students of Peking University, then downtown, would march out to Tiananmen on May 4th, 1919. This is the leader, of course, the great Tsai Ying-pei, perhaps the greatest leader of almost any higher education institution in many ways in the 20th century, a man who brought to Peking University quite distinctive points of view and allowed the students to choose from themselves between liberals like Hu Shi and Marxists like Chen Duxiu. A place of China had at that time one of the strongest, small, but strongest systems, proto-systems of higher education in the world. And after the founding of the national government in 1930, it had a university here. This was originally the gate into Guoli Zhongyang Daxue, National Central University, founded quite deliberately on the model of the University of Berlin in 1930 with the little Brandenburg Gate to welcome you into it. Tsinghua University, of course, has a famous gate as well, a university that was founded on the architectural model of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, because it was the president of that university that convinced the American president to remit Boxer indemnity funds for the establishment of this great university. And it had one of the other most iconic presidents of the 20th century of any university, Mei Qi, president for more than 20 years, a man who led Tsinghua University to national and international status in the 1930s. My own teacher, John Fairbank, learned his Chinese history at Tsinghua University when Mei Qi was first president. It was Mei Qi that oversaw a faculty dedicated to this famous quotation by Chen Yingque in commemoration of Wang Guowei, spirit independent and a mind unfettered. 独立之精神，自由之思想. Characters known today by every faculty member at Tsinghua University. Tsinghua University would have, of course, its changes as China's international connections also change. Some parts of it began to look less like Urbana-Champaign and more like Moscow State. But even at the height of the Cultural Revolution, or at the end of the Cultural Revolution, Tsinghua would have some very notable graduates, such as President Xi. And today, of course, Tsinghua University is a global force in research and in teaching, a place that was designed to send Chinese away to the United States. That was the original purpose of Tsinghua University in 1911, now has in this Su Shimin Shu Yuan, sponsored by an American philanthropist, a college, a postgraduate program that is designed to be the Rhodes Scholarship of the 21st century. The idea here, and it shows Tsinghua's quite reasonable ambition, is that the future leaders of the world, why would you go to Oxford? Why would you go to England? Why would you go to a small, cold, rainy, self-isolating island off the coast of Europe when you could go to Beijing with beautiful blue sky days like this every day? So here we have Tsinghua University, Peking University, rising rapidly in the global rankings, and quite deservedly so. Rising in part because China is rising. And there is a relationship between national power and intellectual power that I will talk about in a moment. But both of these now rank ahead of half or more of the so-called Ivy League in the United States. And if you look at this, and if you look at the trajectory of events over time, the question has to be, how can China not lead? I don't know what President Xi is shooting at here. But how can China not lead in the world of higher education, as it, for example, already is in infrastructure or in certain forms of international investment, and in many areas of innovation? This is one reason. Still statues here at Jiada of a man who did more to destroy education than any other human being over the course of 20th century China. And if you ask any university president, why do you still have a statue of Chairman Mao in your university? They will tell you very quietly, we missed our chance to take it down in the 1980s. Or you have this, Peking University students protesting the arrest of Marxist students and activists near Shenzhen in the summer of 2018. You know, President Xi had urged, again, his wish to get back to original tenets of the early People's Republic. He had urged people to study Marx again. And these students took him at his word, and they went and read the real Marx, not Marxism, but they read Marx, they read Communist Manifesto, they read German ideology, they read a whole range of other things. They also read Engels, and they went to found labor unions in South China. And they were mostly expelled, and 3 university presidents or party secretaries were sacked as a result. Or even at the great University of Tsinghua University, these are 2 very courageous professors who went on the anniversary of the university a year plus ago to lay some flowers at that monument to Wang Guowei about spirits independent and mind unfettered. But they found that that monument was under repair. Most recently, we have 3 major Chinese universities quit the international rankings in order to pursue, as Renmin University put it, a 中国特色的教育, an education with Chinese characteristics. Well, in my view, China's place in changing global orders will not be simply a matter of power politics or ideology. No country has been a leading or the leading power for the past 4 centuries without also leading in the realm of ideas and in institutions that develop ideas. Think of France in the 18th century, Germany and Britain in the 19th century, the United States in the second half of the 20th century, and I very much hope China in the 21st century. For intellectual strength, as Frederick William III may have learned from Humboldt, can be more enduring than martial prowess, and in today's uncertain world, should be more enduring. So a question to be asked, can Chinese universities set global standards in the 21st century? Yes, of course, but not alone. Chinese universities have grown and flourished on international models and in partnership with the great institutions of Europe and North America. It is that company that they wish to keep, to compete in, and to lead. Let me just conclude here with some images of gates. Here is a Marshall Gate originally, now welcoming one into a more peaceful Berlin, or the gate on the new campus of Nanjing University, dedicated to National Central University, one of its founders. Here, the Great Gate of Tsinghua, destroyed in the Cultural Revolution and then rebuilt. Let me end with this gate. In my own university, that's University Hall in back where I used to work when I was Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. And it was through this gate in 1936, on the 300th anniversary of Harvard University, that this gentleman strode, Professor Hu Shi of Peking University, when he received an honorary degree. And he dedicated to Harvard, and any of you who have been to our campus will see this right next to Widener Library, this extraordinary stele, which came actually from the Zongtongfu in Nanjing, a stele in which, inscribed in Hu Shi's calligraphy, are these words: culture is the lifeblood of a nation. It is by virtue of a culture that a nation arises, but truly it is due to learning that a culture flourishes. Intellectuals with deep knowledge and far-sighted vision understand that in establishing a solid foundation for their nation, the utmost priority must be given to the enhancement of learning. And on that much more optimistic note than musings about February 24th, with that I will conclude and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bill. That's deeply impressive how you managed to connect the Ukrainian war and the global crisis emanating from it with your reflections on the global academic world. And I'm also very glad that you ended with a slightly optimistic note, at least. So thank you. So we have some time for some questions, comments. Who would like? Kang, yeah, please.
Thank you, Bill, for this wonderful presentation. I have to say I'm very flattered because of the cover of your paperback book. Is my alma mater, Nanjing University. And then you also mentioned Duke. That's my current employer.
Yeah.
You know, it happens that Dominique and I, just share this common roots. I hope you're not doing this for flattering Dominique. No. Well, I actually have a question because I've recent years studied quite a bit this Chinese, the emergence of this modern liberal arts knowledge in China within this context of modern knowledge formation. I noticed something, I would like to hear your comment. I hear this conflicting narratives, one overriding the other. That is, in this official narrative, the history, the authorial history of Chinese universities. One of the favorite groups, or the group of cluster of universities, is Xinan Lianda during the war, right? Vis-a-vis the Chongqing, National Central University, Guoli Zhongyang Daxue. But here are different stories. I've talked to my colleagues back at Nanda, Zhongyang University. Even though the Zhongyang University was completely crushed, smashed, disintegrated in 1952, there are lots of interesting anecdotes about the story of Nanjing University, or the National Central University, vis-a-vis the Xinan Lianda during the war. I would like to hear your comment on, the two groups. One is kind of a Xinan Lianda formation. The other is the National Central. Thank you.
Okay, we're just going to collect two or three questions.
Sure.
Next one was Shou Fu.
Thank you, Professor Kirby. Thank you, Professor Kirby, for your very rich, inspiring talk. I think you have done a great job in situating the contemporary crisis in the historical context, different kinds, and you link it to the history of universities in particular. So my question, broadly considered, is what do you think? How universities might play a role in addressing contemporary crises? I'm asking this particularly referring to some disquieting moments. For instance, certain kind of conservative, even fascist thinking are actually embedded in leading institutions. And let's don't forget that Trump's certain advisors are educated at Berkeley, Duke, Harvard, and other universities. On the other hand, nowadays we have a lot of new media, kind of new platform reaching out a lot of individuals. Harvard has been doing a great job with that regard. But on the other hand, fascist conservative ideas are also spreading throughout these channels. I'm wondering what you think about that. Thank you.
Okay, Bill.
Okay, great. Thank you. These are great questions, and thank you very much. The history of National Central University, it's an extraordinary and complex history. My colleague at Berkeley, Ye Wenxin, has written a lot about this in her first book on the Alienated Academy some years ago. When you could think of, in its way, National Central University was to be a great research university, but also to be the official university of the Kuomintang. Party secretaries and all of that, and a strong sense of political control in the 1930s, even before its move to Chongqing. Whereas Xinan Lianda, and is really the leadership of Mei Yiqi. This is one of the reasons why Mei Yiqi is called still today Tsinghua Daxue的永远的校长, the eternal president of Tsinghua University. He led the other universities to form Xinan Lianda, and at the height of the greatest crisis in modern Chinese history, the fate of the nation hanging in the balance in that war, he defended the liberal arts, he defended freedom of inquiry, he believed that liberal education was the key to the education of China's future leaders, and he was unrelenting in so doing that. So And if you look today, you mentioned the liberal arts versus other, there isn't a Chinese university, whatever the political constraints, and today they are very, very considerable, much more so than 10 years ago. Every major university has experimented with one form or another of a different general education or liberal education curriculum, maybe most famously at the Yuanpei College at Tsinghua University, at Peking University. But all of them see it as important for educating not simply students in the next generation of engineering, but to be problem solvers and independent thinkers in their own, with various levels of success. Second question, how universities, I'm afraid I can't see you all now, it's kind of, we're all in black here, but if you can see me, that's good enough.
We still can, right? So,
okay, good. So I think universities have a particularly important role to play in times of national difference. I actually accompanied Harvard's president, Larry Bacow, in the year right before COVID, and we went to Beijing, and we met with President Xi to talk about higher education and exchanges. And our position has been that we want to deepen our relation, that universities can do things sometimes that governments cannot. And they actually have a responsibility toward their research partners and friends who share almost entirely the same academic values as they do in the United States or in Europe, and to maintain the connections open and to deepen these connections. Because we learned in the 1950s, when these connections were cut off, it was to no one's mutual benefit, cut off nearly for 30 years. And many of our Chinese friends and colleagues felt abandoned, not that it was a deliberate task, by the fact that their Western colleagues were no longer in contact with them as they had been before. And they were no longer a part of a shared world of universities, but a much more constrained one. So I think universities have a role to play, and I think also in the current Russian-Ukraine crisis, to cut off academic relations with Russian institutions would be, in my view, a very bad idea. But it is a time to actually to work with individuals on areas and issues of common concern.
Thank you. Next one will be Tang Chenxi and then Fan Xin.
Thank you for your talk, which links two topics. One is international relations, and another one is higher education. This is a really very exciting connection you are making. But then I was just wondering whether this connection will bodes well for the future of the Chinese university. So when the German Research University was established, came into the being, Prussia was a rising power and had a rather propitious, I would say, international environment within Germany, with the German-speaking world, but also within Europe. The rise of American university went hand in hand with the rise of the United States as a global power, of course. But now in China, the situation is kind of, as far as I can see, kind of almost reversed, because China, as its leaders always never fail to emphasize, we live in a grim international environment, 严峻的国际环境, which means this grim international environment can exert a lot of pressure on higher education. You just mentioned that how the kind of academic freedom is, how the constraints at American universities are more severe than actually than we can remember in this generation. So this all kind of bodes not very well. And that is also for Chinese universities because the international environment, because of the pressure of the international environment, the Chinese state feels that it has to control its higher education more tightly. And as heartening as your prediction may be, I just wonder whether you could elaborate a little bit about about this connection now in the near future. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Next one is Fan Xin. That's just.
Thanks a lot for the interesting and stimulating presentation. I have been thinking about the global history of higher education, and me myself personally have studied in the United States, in Germany, in China. And I also had the privilege of teaching and working at American and German universities. But there is a problem that has been troubling me. That is, how do you understand the relationship between state and society when we are looking at the higher education system? Especially if we look at the beginning of the rise of a German or Prussian higher education system. It's a state-funded enterprise. So all the famous German university or Prussian university were state-funded university. Of course, we were talking about in the intellectual freedom, but still there's a little issues even back then. And of course, in between, we can see the rise of American higher education. And in the United States, there is a wonderful private institutions like Harvard, but there are also troubling state-funded schools like SUNY, where I'm teaching. So we feel, because this higher education system is not state-supported in general, so there's a lot of problems for people like us who are working at the impoverished public-funded universities. And then there's China, right? So the famous universities that you're introducing in today's China, they're all public-funded. But I guess my big question is, when we're looking at this, we compare and contrast. Do we see that the public-funded universities are a better choice, or should we leave the university higher education to the privatized marketplace? So what would you suggest to the globalized future of higher education? Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Maybe Bill, you.
Okay, should I try that? Yeah. Thanks. And the first set of questions, I think a question to ask, is liberal education possible in an illiberal society, or in an illiberal polity? And the German answer of the 19th century is broadly yes, but not perfectly so. Certainly, the professoriate at the University of Berlin was not in any sense representative of the broader population, either of Berlin or of Prussia or of Germany. I don't think there was a single social democrat on the Berlin faculty when the war broke out in 1914. And so there were sets of shared and extraordinarily conservative values that defined that professoriate in its time. Secondly, I really don't believe that China is facing a grim international environment. And actually, I'm not sure I believe that China's leaders believe that China has an impossibly grim international environment. It doesn't take much as a historian to figure out that if you look over the last several hundred years, today, nobody threatens China. At least nobody threatens Chinese borders, not Russia, not Japan, not Taiwan, not Vietnam. You could argue that there's a dispute with India and so on. The only conceivable threat to China from the outside in a physical sense is from North Korea, because you don't know where one of their missiles just might end up. So China is actually in the best strategic position of its modern history. And it's the lack of recognition of that by a politically insecure, incredibly powerful, but powerfully insecure leadership that is, all of the challenges for China really are domestic, not international. There's not a sense of, at least I think it's a reasonable viewpoint if you look at China since the Opium War to today and look at what this extraordinary period of peace from 1979 to 2022 has produced for China and indeed for the whole world. On the second question, I'm a strong believer in public higher education, and German universities have shown, they've always been publicly funded. There are almost all of them. There are some very interesting private ones today, but they've always been publicly funded, and they reflect also the kind of strengths of different eras of time. This is a time, in my view, of great renewal in German higher education. I think the Excellence Initiative has done a great deal to spur innovation and initiative, even if not everyone thinks it's a wonderful idea. You see enormous amount of innovation in German universities today in a manner that you did not see in the 1970s, 80s, or even in the 1990s. And the question, the big challenge, and this is quite different for German universities or French universities or Japanese or Chinese universities. Chinese universities today are extraordinarily well. The American scene shows you the risk of assuming that public universities like Berkeley can be, at the end of the day, privately funded. And now Berkeley gets, somewhere about 12% of its budget from the state. It has been rapidly weaned off the state. So it's a public university with increasingly private funding and not sufficient of either sort. And this is a major, major challenge, but it's a challenge faced and also by the University of Massachusetts here in Massachusetts. It's faced by the SUNY system, which was built up by Governor Rockefeller in his day as to be the great rival of the UC system on the East Coast. And you see the limits really of Americans' willingness. The Americans have always been unwilling to pay taxes, it seems, for anything. That's why we had the Boston Tea Party, not far from where I'm sitting. But it is also a lack of investment in a common future that is one of the great troubling things of American higher education today. And I do again believe that if the public universities decline, the private universities will not be far behind. And for them, as well as for Chinese universities today, which are so extraordinarily well funded, the question is not how good you are when the money is pouring in, is how good you are when it stops. Because it will stop.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so now we're just at a more pessimistic note, but
yeah, sorry. Maybe one more question to end on a happier note, if you want.
No, but I think we'll have to stop right now. Yeah?
Okay.
So on that more well, we had a good combination of pessimistic and optimistic notes. Yeah? So thanks a lot for this wonderful contribution, this wonderful speech, Bill, and to your answers to our Q&A session. Yeah.
And I'm so sorry I couldn't be there in person in what looks like a beautiful room and in Göttingen. So I will come and visit at a later point if you don't mind.
You're more than welcome. Yeah, that's the historical observatory where Gauss. Thank you very much, Bill. Yeah? Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
So I think we're going to start with a new panel. Maybe we'll take a 5-minute break. So they give the new panel chair, Hans van Es, and all the other panelists a chance to move over. Everybody else can grab a coffee or something. Yeah? Oh, okay. Ja, das nicht ganz. Wir haben jetzt hier. Ja, ich dachte, hier gibt es auch irgendeinen.